Hello, I'm Diana Reich, the Artistic Director of the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival, Join the Conversation, and I'd like to welcome you from wherever you may be watching. Transforming the way that the festival is delivered, from live appearances to an online version, and offering an even stronger, more diverse and plentiful series of events, is a reflection of our belief that literature and the arts provide a catalyst for dialogue, creativity, empathy, laughter and tears, binding communities together. We're enormously grateful to all our speakers who've dedicated their time and talents to the festival. Please buy their books as a way of enhancing the festival experience. It's my pleasure to invite you, on behalf of my colleagues and board, as well as myself, to join the conversation. We hope that you'll do so in person next November, if at all possible. Charleston in South Carolina is a beautiful, historic and hospitable town, and the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival will definitely be going from strength to strength.
I'm Suzanne Pollack, Director of Development for the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival. This year, more than ever, we are so grateful to our generous donors, returning and new, who've made it possible to offer free sessions to everyone everywhere, building a truly international audience. There's still time for you to become a donor. We're taking donations throughout the month of November. So if you would like to become a sponsor, and we urge you to do so, please contact me using my email on the website. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Diana Reich, Artistic Director of the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival, Join the Conversation. It gives me great pleasure to introduce this session, Hamnet, featuring novelist Maggie O'Farrell and chaired by writer Bernard Cornwell. I'm doing so from London, which couldn't be more apt, as the event revolves around Maggie O'Farrell's award-winning novel, Hamnet, about the short life of Shakespeare's only son. Although he never left his birthplace in Stratford-upon-Avon, his incomparable father is indelibly associated with the London theatrical scene. Hamnet won this year's prestigious Women's Prize for Fiction in the UK. It's a multifaceted novel, combining an elegy for Hamnet, a poignant study of grief, a history of the plague that afflicted Elizabethan England, a pharmacopoeia of herbal medicine, and an imaginative reconstruction of the origins of Shakespeare's greatest tragedy. The names Hamlet and Hamnet were interchangeable at the time. Maggie O'Farrell is the author of the memoir I Am, and 8 novels, including The Hand That First Held Mine, Instructions for a Heatwave, and This Must Be the Place. She lives in Edinburgh. Bernard Cornwell was born in London, but has spent most of his adult life in America. He's well known for his popular Sharp series of historical novels, the 13th of which, Warlords, is just published. His book, Fools and Horses, is a fictionalized account of the rivalrous relationship between Shakespeare and his younger brother. I'd like to express my gratitude to Maggie O'Farrell and Bernard Cornwell for their contribution to the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival in this dramatic year, and to welcome everyone who's joining the conversation.
Hello, I'm Bernard Cornwell, and for the Charleston to Charleston Festival, I'm very honoured to be joined by Maggie O'Farrell, the author of Hamnet, which won this year's Women's Prize for Fiction. It's an astonishing book. On the American cover, it is called A Thing of Shimmering Wonder. And Maggie, I must say that in the words of the old hymn, I'm lost in wonder, love and praise. It is an astonishing achievement. So thank you very much. Welcome to the Charleston to Charleston. And I believe you're going to start by reading us a couple of excerpts from this Thing of Shimmering Wonder.
Oh, thank you so much, Bernard. It's really nice to almost meet you, sort of meet you, and that's a really nice and generous introduction, so thank you. I am going to read a little bit from just the opening of the book, where Hamnet is age 11 and he is running around the house trying to find someone to help him because his twin sister Judith has been taken ill. And he thinks the house is empty, but he's just come upon his grandfather. The room is filled with gloom, coverings pulled over most of the windows. His grandfather is standing with his back towards him in a crouched position, fumbling with something. Papers, a cloth bag, counters of some sort. Hamnet gives a polite cough. His grandfather wheels around, his face wild, furious, his arm flailing through the air, as if warding off an assailant. "Who's there?" he cries. "It's me, Hamnet." His grandfather sits down with a thud. "You scare the wits out of me," he cries. "Whatever do you mean, creeping about like that?" "I'm sorry," Hamnet says. "I was calling and calling, but no one answered. Judith is unwell and they've gone out." His grandfather speaks over him with a curt flick of his wrist. "What do you want with all those women anyway?" He seizes the neck of a pitcher and aims it towards a cup. The liquid, ale, Hamnet thinks, slops out precipitously, some into the cup and some onto the papers on the table, causing his grandfather to curse, then dab at them with his sleeve. For the first time, it occurs to Hamnet that his grandfather might be drunk. "Do you know where they've gone?" Hamnet asks. "Eh?" his grandfather says, still mopping his papers. His anger at their spoiling seems to unsheath itself and stretch out from him like a rapier. Hamnet can feel the tip of it wander about the room, seeking an opponent. "Don't stand there gawping," his grandfather hisses. "Help me." Hamnet shuffles forward a step, then another. He is wary, his father's words circling his mind. Stay away from your grandfather when he is in one of his black humours. Be sure to stand well clear of him. His father had said this to him on his last visit, when they had been helping unload a cart from the tannery. John, his grandfather, had dropped a bundle of skins into the mud and, in a sudden fit of temper, had hurled a paring knife at the yard wall. His father had immediately pulled Hamnet back behind him out of the way, but John had barged past them into the house without a word. His father had taken Hamnet's face in both of his hands, fingers curled in at the nape of his neck, his gaze steady and searching. "He'll not touch your sisters, but it's you I worry for," he had muttered, his brow puckering. "You know the humour I mean, don't you?" Hamnet had nodded, but wanted the moment to be prolonged, for his father to keep holding his head like that. It gave him a sensation of lightness, of safety, of being entirely known and treasured. At the same time, he was aware of a curdling unease swirling about inside him, like a meal his stomach didn't want. He thought of the snip and snap of words that punctured the air between his father and grandfather, the way his father continually reached to loosen his collar when seated at table with his parents. "Swear to me," his father had said as they stood in the yard, his voice hoarse. "Swear it. I need to know you'll be safe when I'm not here to see to it." Hamnet believes he is keeping his word. He is standing well back. He is at the other side of the fireplace. His grandfather couldn't reach him here, even if he tried. His grandfather is draining his cup with one hand and shaking the drops off a sheet of paper with the other. "Take this," he orders, holding out the page. Hamnet bends forward, not moving his feet, and takes it with the very tips of his fingers. His grandfather's eyes are slitted, watchful. His tongue pokes out of the side of his mouth. He sits in his chair, hunched, an old sad toad on a stone. "And this." His grandfather holds out another paper. Hamnet bends forward in the same way, keeping the necessary distance. He thinks of his father, how he would be proud of him, how he would be pleased. Quick as a fox, his grandfather makes a lunge. Everything happened so fast that afterwards, Hamnet won't be sure in what sequence it all occurred. The page swings to the floor between them. His grandfather's hand seizes him by the wrist, then the elbow, hauling him forwards into the gap, the necessary space his father had told him to observe. And his other hand, which still holds the cup, is coming up fast. Hamnet is aware of streaks in his vision, red, orange, the colours of fire, streaming in from the corner of his eye, before he feels the pain. It is a sharp, clubbed, jabbing pain. The rim of the cup has struck him just below the eyebrow. "That'll teach you," his grandfather is saying in a calm voice. to creep up on people. Thank you.
Maggie, I think you, I, and a couple of dozen other people have written novels about Shakespeare, or in which Shakespeare is a character. But yours has a peculiar distinction. You never mention his name, not once. That's obviously deliberate. Why did you do it?
Well, I think I'm always really impressed by, you know, people like you or say Anthony Burgess who can get that name and harness it and make it completely your own, because I found that I had such, I don't know how you felt before you started your Shakespeare novel, but I found I had terrible vertigo, you know, wanting to inhabit the skin of this man and wanting to put words into his mouth. I don't know if you did as well. You could nod or shake.
Well, exactly the same, and totally intimidated. I mean, how could you put words into Shakespeare's mouth?
No, who would dare? Who would dare to do that? But also the sense that, you know, he's not. It's also, I think there was also that sense that that we all have our own relationship with Shakespeare inside our own heads, don't we? I mean, I don't mean novelists who write about Shakespeare. Everybody, you know, we all do. You know, he's sort of affected our. He sort of continues to sort of define how we view ourselves and how we view others and our relationship with others. And he, you know, he pervades our very language. He's the reason why we say so many phrases and so many sort of sayings that we reach for are all his, you know. So it was also that, but also, you know, I think the book for me was, you know, I've wanted to write this book for such a long time, and I've always felt that Hamnet and Hamlet's death has been much too overlooked. You know, he's been really sort of forgotten really by history, or overlooked by scholars and academics and biographers, and also actually I think, you know, popular culture in a sense. But always for me, I've always felt that the biggest sort of drama of Shakespeare's life really happened off stage. You know, it happened in Stratford, and I think without this boy, this 11-year-old boy dying in that hot summer, we wouldn't have the play Hamlet, and we probably wouldn't have Twelfth Night. So I suppose what I was asking people to do was to try and sort of forget, or trying to get readers to forget everything they think they know about Shakespeare's story. And of course, you know, there's a very valid reason as to why most novels, or you know, obviously biographies or scholars have concentrated on Shakespeare's career in London, because that's the main it is the main event. We can't argue with that. But it seems to me, I think I wanted to write the story behind it, in a sense, the story behind the tapestry or the arras. And so I suppose I wanted to divorce him from his name. You know, I wanted people to think of him as a man, because I think that's what he was back in Stratford. Actually, I don't think he was necessarily a player or a playwright or a genius. I think he was just a bloke in Stratford. He was a father, he was a son, you know, he was a husband. And I think, I think when I was writing about it, I don't know how you felt, but I was intrigued at how people in Stratford might have seen him at the time, what he would have been like. I mean, he must have stuck out like a sore thumb, don't you think?
I'm sure he did. I meant to begin with a question from somebody who wanted to ask this of you. It's from Kathryn Salmanowitz, and her question intrigues me. She asks, is it really true that you dressed up as Hamlet when you were a 16-year-old?
I'm afraid it is. I have to confess, it is true. I was studying the play Hamlet for my hires, my Scottish hires, and it just really, I don't know what age you were when you first read it, but it really got under my skin as a 16-year-old. You know, it was the kind of play that spoke to me, and I felt that Hamlet the Prince was sort of part of my DNA in a way. You know, I felt kind of related to him, you know. He was probably my cousin, or maybe perhaps my brother. And so I did. Pardon?
Were you a goth? I mean, black makeup.
I did wear quite a lot of black. I wasn't really a goth. I didn't have all the masses of eyeliner and the black hair, but I wasn't far off, possibly. But and so yes, so there was a fancy dress party in which I decided to go dressed as Hamlet, and I did actually. When I say the word borrow, it's not quite true. I did borrow the skull from the laboratory, from the biology laboratory in my school. I mean, I did put it back the next day. Well, I said, right, I didn't exactly ask, but I did put it back, and it was so I did. It's actually very handy. There was a kind of, I think it was real actually. This, you know, it was this kind of sinister skull. So I did hold that all night. It's quite easy to hold a skull. I discovered there's a very neat hold you can stick your thumb in just on at the base of the skull. You probably know this, Bernard.
Alas, poor Yorick. Now, novelists, I know, do a very different kind of research from historians, because where there are gaps, and there are so many gaps in Shakespeare's life, you bring imagination to bear. What did you discover about him that surprised you?
I don't know. I mean, so much. That's the thing, you know. I mean, I studied literature at university, and you know, I read lots of scholarly works about Shakespeare, and I hadn't really read much about his biography at all, actually, until I started researching this book. And so you know, I think in a sense, you know, if you do have a degree of familiarity with his plays, there's a part of you that thinks you know about him, but then actually you start reading these books and you realize that actually he's really very unknowable. You know, even if you can read these massive 500-page biographies of him, and in a sense they're all a bit novelistic, actually, aren't they? I don't know if you found this when you were researching for your Shakespeare book.
Yes, there's a lot of surmise. And you, of course, are writing about the lost years. I mean,
Yeah.
your book has two time frames. One is when Hamnet is, I guess, 10, 11. And the other goes back much earlier to when William Shakespeare meets his bride. Why did you choose the two different periods?
Well, I think I really wanted to start with Hamnet the boy, and I wanted to have as much of him, the child, as I possibly could. I was very intrigued. I think 11, actually, because he died when he was 11 and almost 11 and a half. And to me, it's a very sort of specific age. You know, it's a very kind of specific developmental stage. It's the kind of it's the last gasp of childhood, in a sense. It's the high water mark of childhood. You know, it's the last few months, even, or last few years, before that child starts tipping into adolescence and then tipping into being a young man. So it's a particularly poignant phase, I think, in a child's life. So I was really interested in just having the book open when he is 11, and it's a fortnight or so before he dies, and I wanted readers to see him and to appreciate that this boy was real. You know, he was a real living boy with a beating heart, and he was loved. You know, he was loved by his family, because he's such a, you know, I mean, if we think we know little about Shakespeare, we know so little about this boy. You know, so little. We know a little bit more about his sisters, because they lived to an extraordinary advanced age, actually. Susanna was in her 60s, and Judith, Hamlet's twin, was in her early 70s, which is astonishing, really, for the early 17th century. But Hamlet the boy is very mysterious. We don't even know where he's buried. You know, we know he's buried somewhere in that church, but we don't know where. He has no gravestone. And I walked around every single inch of that churchyard just to make absolutely sure. And I knew that he was there somewhere under my feet, but I don't know where his bones are. Nobody knows. So I wanted to give this boy, this forgotten boy, an absolute presence and a voice, and to tell his story.
Well, you did do that. And the book is an extraordinarily emotional book. I don't mind admitting that you took me to tears many times. I mean, not just the death scene, but when his mother lays him out, or before that, when he lies beside Judith, which is an extraordinary scene. Did you cry when you were writing it?
I did, actually. Yeah, I think you'd have to be pretty stony-hearted if you didn't. I mean, I did sort of dread writing those scenes, you know, because I knew, you know, it's one of those things, you know, I don't know if you find this as well, you know, you create these characters and you set them living and you set them chatting and breathing and talking and laughing, but the horrible thing is, I knew, you know, before I started the book, that at some point I was going to have to, you know, do away with this child. I was going to have to imagine this death, and I was going to have to write it, and that was quite painful. I mean, one of the reasons I put off writing the book for so long, because it's a book I wanted to write for a really long time, is that I have a son and two daughters, as the Shakespeares did. I mean, the age is different, the sort of order of their age is different, but I found that I could not write this book while my own son was under the age of 11. I needed him to be older than 12 before I could even begin to write it, or even kind of grapple with the subject. It's not, I mean, I'm not a particularly superstitious person, but I just couldn't do it. I knew that, you know, to write that I would have to put myself inside, you know, I'd have to put myself in the place of a woman who sits at her child's bedside and is forced to watch him die, and then of course lays him out for burial, because that's what you did in those days. You laid out your loved ones. It was the woman of the house. And I also found, you know, I mean, I'm going back to sort of talking about Shakespeare. I've tried where possible, you know, and has scant, you know, there are a few such scant details about him. I tried wherever possible with the book never to go against something that was actually known. So I tried to gather as much as I possibly could, and I tried not to ignore any fact. So I discovered that there was evidence that Shakespeare was on tour in Kent when Hamnet died. So it's not even known whether he was at the funeral, which is so heartbreaking. You know, I mean, imagine getting a letter saying your child has died, and then, you know, you return home and they're already buried. You know, it's agony. It's an agonizing thought. So I had to put that into the novel. And then the idea that she was there, their mother was there on her own without him, without the father, and she had to deal with this I mean, not obviously there were other people in the household, but to deal with that on your own is very heartbreaking. So I did cry, absolutely, quite a lot actually.
I'm not surprised. You talk about Hamnet's mother. The awful Frank Harris, in his Life of Shakespeare, which was written, just over 100 years ago, says Shakespeare's loathing for his wife was measureless. Now, I think you have completely recast Anne, or we should call her Agnes Hathaway. She's an astonishing character in your book, and brilliant. What lay behind that? Why did you, in a sense, make her almost the central character?
Yeah, well, actually, I became so furious when I read things like the Frank Harris. I mean, you know, I would love to actually sit down and have a coffee with Frank Harris and say, where did you get this from? You know, show me your evidence. How do you know this? You know, because I can't find any evidence to support that theory. And the problem is, it's such a popular theory. It's one that we are constantly fed, you know, through biographers, through academia, through screenwriters, you know, we're constantly fed this narrative that, you know, she tricked him into marriage. She was an older peasant. She was stupid. She was illiterate. She trapped him. She was a strumpet. She was, you know, he had to run away to London to get away from her. I mean, there's nothing that I could find that supported any of this at all. I mean, of course, everybody will throw up the famous, you know, behest of the second best bed. But, you know, if you look at the actual document of the will, the second best bed behest is an interlineation, because she would have been entitled to, I think, 1/3 of his property. That was just the law in the early 17th century. So she, so, you know, he squeezed in this second best bed between two other lines. I mean, to be honest, I mean, I'm sure you've seen it, Bernard, but the will is a document completely arid and emotionless. You know, you would never ever think that perhaps the writer who wrote the greatest lines about love, you wouldn't recognize him at all in this. You know, that he doesn't show his wife any affection, but actually he doesn't show anyone else any affection either. You know, there's no affection for his daughters or his sister or other people who are mentioned. It's a very odd document, but, you know, for goodness sake, the man was dying. You know? I mean, probably of typhoid, which is a particularly nasty death. But also the things that always were really important to me was that at the end of his career, when he retired, and he was equivalent of a multi-millionaire, he was an incredibly successful businessman, as well as being a pretty good playwright and probably a pretty good actor as well. But he chose to come back. I mean, he could have set up house anywhere he wanted, but he chose to come back to Stratford to live out his retirement with her. And that doesn't speak of a man whose hatred for his wife is, you know, immeasurable. And also, you know, every single penny he earned, he lived in really modest lodgings in London, and he sent all his money back to Stratford. He bought his wife and daughters an enormous house after Hamlet died. He bought fields and cottages and he leased them out. He was this incredibly successful landlord. So, and again, that doesn't seem like somebody who regretted his marriage.
No, it doesn't. And there is Sonnet 145, 145, which seems to be addressed to Anne Hathaway. But you call her Agnes, because that was the real name?
Well, I found one of the things I looked at again, which was another will, the will of Richard Hathaway, who's the woman we know is Anne Hathaway's father. He died a year before they married, and he left her a very generous dowry. And in it, he refers to her as my daughter Agnes. And I felt so, I was so shocked when I saw that, because I thought, on top of everything else, not only has she been called a strumpet and a cradle snatcher and an ignorant peasant for almost half a century, but we've been calling her by the wrong name, because presumably anyone who knows, the person who would know her proper name would be her father, really. So it was such an opportunity in a sense. You were talking about going back to kind of, breathing life into these spaces or these voids between these characters, the sort of story of these characters. I just wanted to give her a whole new lease of life, and I wanted to suggest that actually the idea that their marriage was a partnership, that they did love each other, because there's so many examples in his plays you can find. I mean, I know you have to be very circumspect about reading too much of his biography out of it, just extrapolating his biography from his plays, but there are a lot of very faithful, loving wives in his plays. It's a kind of recurring motif, these women who stay perhaps with men who they're perhaps a little bit flighty, but there is a lot of faithful marital wifely love in the plays. And I think, the idea that there was actually a sort of exchange of artistry between them, because, it's obvious that, yes, she probably was illiterate, because what daughter of a sheep farmer in the 16th century would have been taught to read? What would be the purpose of that? But it doesn't mean she was stupid. So I wanted to give her a kind of artistry of her own, which is why, and there's a lot of, one of the things that, of course, about Shakespeare that's so fascinating to all of us is the reach, the extraordinary range of knowledge that he displays in his metaphors and in his plays. And there's quite a lot about herbology in Hamnet. And it's very sort of informed. When the Mad Ophelia hands plants to people, those plants are a particular cure for some kind of character flaw she sees in them. And so I decided to give that expertise to her, to Agnes, and also hawking. There's a lot of hawking metaphors in Shakespeare's work, and so I decided to give her a kestrel, which also meant I could go and learn to fly a kestrel, which is probably the most fun thing I've ever done in research for the book. What about you? What's the most fun thing you've ever done in the name of research?
Lord. I walked, very different. I walked all Wellington's battlefields in India.
Did you?
While we're talking about birds of prey, I saw an eagle owl, which was
wow.
wingspan of about 6 feet, and it was just quite glorious. But let's get back to you.
Sorry.
Some time ago you wrote, I won't call it a memoir, but a wonderful book called I Am, I Am, I Am. And in it, you recount your brushes with death. And I'm wondering how that informed Hamnet, particularly Judith's illness.
Well, I'm sure you find this as well, but I always think that every book you write is a kind of reaction to its predecessor. I think every book you embark upon, there's always something you don't quite know how to do, and the kind of process of the book, you try and learn it, or you make an attempt to learn it. And then at the end, it might be something technical, like, I don't know, writing a book from multiple points of view, or using the present tense, or I don't know, whatever, the first person singular, or it might be some kind of thematic thing that you need to grapple with. In a sense, every book is, I find anyway, it's almost a kind of a puzzle that you need to solve for your own interests, either sort of thematically or technically, I think. And I think certainly, that, writing I Am, which is all about our relationship with death, and then, what it means to us to have gone through a near-death experience, how it changes you, how it sort of takes up residence inside you. you know, and I think I couldn't really have written Hamnet unless I had that as a kind of building block, in a say, or a kind of springboard. You know, I think there was something I needed to write about. I needed to explore my own relationship with it, or my own experiences of, you know, brushes with death. And then I think maybe only then could I go on to write this book that I'd wanted to write for a really long time.
Now, the question I've been wanting to ask you, and then I'm going to ask you some of the questions which people sent to us, but this is the one I really want, and I'm going to read from your book. And I'll hold it up so that people can see it, so in case they see it. Here we go, Maggie. This is talking about the unnamed William Shakespeare. We'll just call him the author. And it's just before a performance of his play. He cannot tell as he stands there whether or not this new play is good. Sometimes, as he listens to his company speak the lines, he thinks he has come close to what he wanted it to be. Other times, he feels he has entirely missed the mark. It is good. It is bad. It is somewhere in between. How does a person ever tell? So, Maggie, tell me about Hamnet. Is it good? Is it bad? What is your feeling about this book now that you finished it?
Are we talking Hamnet or Hamlet?
Talking Hamnet and your book.
I don't know. I mean, I think again. It's funny you pick out those lines. It would only be another writer, I think, who would pick those out. I think, you know, I think there are certain points in any book, actually, any novelist, where perhaps the novelist lets his or her mask drop, and I think I was talking without my mask at that point. I mean, I think it's really hard. I think, in a sense, the writer of a play or a novel is probably the worst person, in a sense, to judge if it's any good, you know. And I think sometimes
you asked yourself the question.
Yeah, I think we're always asking ourselves that question, aren't we? When we're writing, or when we're editing, or when it's always. And I think there are some days when you look at it and you think, yes, okay, I've come close to what I wanted it to be. And other days where you just think, this is an absolute waste of time. This is all rubbish. I should start again. I should find another job. No, absolutely. But I think, in a way, I don't know, I've always found, you know, the sort of process of writing a book is a kind of wave pattern. You have these kind of surges of optimism where you put words down on paper and you think, yes, I've got momentum. This book has a pulse. It's happening. And then you have this huge crash where you think, it's all absolute rubbish. What am I thinking? I need to cut, you know, 3 chapters out of this. It's all awful. And I think that's so you have this kind of creation of words, and then you have the edit, and then you have another sort of surge, and you think, no, I can do it. I've got a new lease of life. And then you have another crash. But I think you need both of those phases. You know, you need the optimism and you need the self-criticism, because otherwise you just write sort of, you know, 200,000 baggy words of nonsense.
I think that the words on the front of your American edition are right. A thing of shimmering wonder. It is an absolutely brilliant and wonderful book. Now, Susan Rivers.
Coming from you, it really does. That means so much coming from you. So I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Well, you made me cry. Susan Rivers asks, I would like to ask Miss O'Farrell about her own experiences with playhouses. The scene at the Globe towards the end of the book proved remarkably moving for me as someone who spent many years working with others to achieve that kind of ephemeral miracle in professional theatre, which she achieves in the novel. Does the author have a theatrical background? And if not, what sources did you draw on to achieve that level of authenticity?
I don't have a theatrical background at all. In fact, I would be and am terrified of actually going on stage. I would never ever have been an actor. I would be a terrible actor. One thing I have had and continue to have a problem with is stammer. So just the idea of having to, you know, relay lines all at once. I was very briefly involved in student theatre a long time ago, but only behind the scenes. So no, I don't. I mean, my only experience really of playhouses and theatres are being in the audience. And I did go to the Globe, you know, the kind of reconstructed Globe, several times to try to imagine what it was like. And it is roughly on the site. But the one thing I did discover during my research was that, of course, the site of the original Globe was across the river. It was in what's now the City of London, East London. And I discovered that when I first moved to London, I lived in a really, it was sort of 1990, probably 1994. And I lived in a really kind of dilapidated, actually I squatted in a really dilapidated warehouse apartment. I mean, it wasn't a kind of cool warehouse apartment, but, you know, nicely done. It was actually really quite manky and freezing cold. And I realised I realised looking at the map of where the original theatre was, which is called the Theatre, the original Shakespeare Theatre, was on that road where I'd moved to London. It was just on the corner, which was such an astonishing moment because I was looking at the map and I suddenly thought, my God, that's the street at the corner at the end of the street that I first moved to London and I lived on. And I lived there for however long it was, a year, and I must have walked past the site of the original theatre so many times. But so that gave me a strange kind of shiver down my spine.
And Kathryn Salmanowitz, who I asked one of her questions earlier, she also asked another. Some scholars reject the idea that Hamlet the play has any connection with Shakespeare's son Hamlet. You don't, obviously, you disagree with that, and your book suggests that Shakespeare transposes his grief onto perhaps his best work. Can you speak more about that?
Yes, I mean, certainly, you know, I think, I mean, the thing about Shakespeare is there are so many theories that circulate and revolve about him, and so many just ideas about, you know, people are so intrigued with him and continue to be, and will probably always be, actually, and we will all want to kind of fill in these voids and these gaps. The point is, nobody really knows, so nobody is right and nobody is wrong because but to me it seems, you know, unavoidably significant that he would call the play, so he, you know, he calls the play, he calls the prince, and he calls the ghost after his dead son. I mean, that's not nothing, is it? I mean, how can it not be connected? I mean, it's an extraordinarily significant act. It's a strange act, you know. I mean, it's so, to me, it speaks volumes. I sort of, I find it hard to believe that anybody wouldn't see that as significant. They just think, oh well, he was just couldn't think of a name, so he thought, why not? I'll just use my dead sons. I mean, that doesn't happen, does it? It's so significant. And if you read the play through that lens, I mean, obviously there are 1,000 different interpretations of all his plays, and all of them, you know, have a certain amount of validity. But if you read the play looking at it through those eyes, through that lens of the loss of his son, I found it really extraordinary. I mean, I found this a reference, which is possibly apocryphal. You never know with Shakespeare and these things, but that Shakespeare himself did take the part of the ghost in the first productions of Hamlet, which again is really peculiar because, of course, you know, what they're looking for in the first opening scenes is the ghost. They want to find this ghost, you know, and they want Hamlet, the prince, the alive prince, and of course the ghost is also called Hamlet. So you've got this kind of personality that's split. One of them is alive, one of them is dead. The alive one is desperate to see the dead one, and it's he's inverted the father and the son, and that to me feels unbearably poignant. You know, because I did originally think that this book was going to be a ghost story, and I was going to have Hamnet, the boy, haunting his father. But actually, what seemed to me, as a bit when I started embarking upon it, what seemed to be much more poignant and much more painful and more realistic, actually, is the fact that you might be desperate to see the ghost of your dead son, to have some connection. But what's more realistic is that you can't. You never find him. You never make that connection because he's gone.
And in your final scene in the book, there's almost, I mean, this is a book of heartbreaking grief. And yet, when Agnes sees the play, it kind of soothes her.
Yes, well, I always wondered how Shakespeare's wife might have felt about him writing a play with their dead son's name. I'm not sure I would have been thrilled, but I mean, even I always wondered, well, did he ask her? Did he say, by the way, this is what my new play's called? Or I mean, I don't know. It is extraordinary. It's extraordinary for him to do it, but I often wonder how she felt about it, and whether she ever saw it, and how she felt about the play. So and that was the kind of, there was that question in my mind, and I always knew the book was going to have to end at the Globe, and I always knew that it was going to end with the final, the very earliest production of Hamlet, with, of course, the famous play.
Last words, remember me.
In the role of the ghost. I mean, how could you not? I mean, how, knowing that as a novelist, how could you just kind of ignore it? So it was always going to happen, but I wanted her to see it, because there is a lot of debate about whether or not his wife and his daughters, Judith and Susanna, ever saw his plays. It's not entirely certain. I mean, it took 4 or 5 days to ride, to walk from Stratford-upon-Avon to London. It was not an inconsiderable journey. Or if you rode a horse, it would probably take 3 or 4 days. So it was an undertaking to get there. But I like to think that if she had watched any of the plays, it would have been Hamlet.
Yes, I hope so. Maggie, it's been an absolute and total pleasure talking to you. And for all of you who are watching this, all I can say is buy and read this book. It genuinely is an extraordinary work of art. I shouldn't use the word masterpiece, but mistress piece sounds so terrible. But I think it is
I like it.
a classic. All right, it's a mistress piece. And Maggie O'Farrell, thank you so very much for talking to us, and above all, for writing Hamlet.
Thank you so much, Bernard. It was such a pleasure to almost meet you, and I hope we get to meet in person one day.
Well, you have to write another book just as good, and then you can come to Charleston.
Okay, then. I'm done.